With the end of World War I, the United States found itself in a position of strength in the world as the countries of Europe attempted to recover from the experience that was the Great War. As America entered the 1920s, the country's economy was booming. For some, the 1920s was the Roaring '20s. For others, it was the Jazz Age. Some refer to it as the New Era, but for others, it was the status quo. The 1920s was the decade of Babe Ruth of the automobile, F. Scott Fitzgerald in movies, Louis Armstrong in the radio, the Ku Klux Klan in Sacco and Vanzetti, and Charles Darwin versus the people of Dayton, Tennessee. It's 1920s America. Nativists are those who are opposed to those not born in the United States. After World War I, there was a fear of people flooding into America from war-torn Europe and Russia, and veterans returning home to limited job opportunities. This led to a change in immigration policy from a more open immigration policy to one that was stricter throughout the 1920s. There were a series of events that demonstrated the anti-American sentiment during the 1920s. The Red Scare, in the wake of the rise of a communist government in Russia, increased fears in the United States about communism. It was believed at the time that labor strikes were inspired by the writings of Karl Marx, and when dozens of bombs were mailed to government and business leaders in 1919, there was a fear of a communist uprising in the United States. In response to this Red Scare, as it was known, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer had 6,000 suspected radicals. Radicals were those who were immigrants that were communists, socialists, or anarchists, or at least believed to be, had them arrested. These individuals were denied the right to trial, they were denied the right to have a lawyer, and they were denied the right to know what they were being held for. Hundreds of these immigrants were deported without a trial. Palmer's predicted communist uprising never occurred, but the Red Scare turned more people against immigrants. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial, following their arrest in May 1920, also highlighted the nativism of the 1920s. Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested in South Braintree, Massachusetts for murder with very little evidence. But as confessed anarchists, they were presumed guilty. To much worldwide protest, they were convicted, sentenced to death, and executed in 1927, and again with very little evidence proving that they had committed the crime. The governor of Massachusetts and later failed presidential candidate, Michael Dukakis, in 1977 proclaimed Sacco and Vanzetti had been unfairly tried and convicted. Their conviction was a result of the nativist sentiment that was prevalent in the United States during the 1920s. Also, the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan is a prime example of the 1920s nativism. The Ku Klux Klan that emerged in the wake of the Civil War as a response to improvements in the lives of African Americans had died out by the mid-1870s. But the Ku Klux Klan reemerged in 1915 with calls for 100% Americanism. The 1920s Ku Klux Klan differed from its 1860s predecessor in that the new Ku Klux Klan discriminated against more than just African Americans. This new Klan still targeted African Americans, but now their targets included Latinos, Jews, Catholics, anyone not born in the United States, socialists, communists. Basically, the Klan liked you as long as you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Another difference was that the 1920s Ku Klux Klan used politics to affect the country at all levels, attempting to defend what it believed were traditional American values against a changing American landscape. You can see a Klan rally in Washington, D.C. in the picture right there. By 1925, the Ku Klux Klan had around 4 million members and had spread out of the South into the Midwest, so it was no longer just a Southern organization. The state of Tennessee passed a law banning the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools in 1925 because fundamentalists who believed in the literal interpretation of the Bible were opposed to Darwin's theory. John Scopes, a 24-year-old biology teacher, was willing to defy the law after the American Civil Liberties Union offered to pay his legal fees. When Scopes taught his students about evolution in his classroom in Dayton, Tennessee, he was arrested, and the Scopes trial, or the monkey trial as it was also known, began. The trial drew such a crowd that the proceedings were moved outdoors. It featured heavyweights on both sides. Clarence Darrow represented Scopes, and William Jennings Bryan, 3 times a presidential candidate, a congressman, a secretary of war who was a devout Christian and fiery orator, represented Tennessee. The trial was followed by people around the world, and Americans were able to follow the trial on the radio. Ultimately, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, which would later be overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court on the technicality. The trial shows a growing debate between science and religion in America that will become prominent in the 1920s. Also, it challenges the traditional views that had been held and were relatively unchallenged until this time period. And this debate over the teaching of evolution in schools is still being waged today in the 21st century. Prohibition was the banning of alcohol in the United States starting in 1920. There had been a strong temperance movement in the United States dating back to the 19th century. Proponents of prohibition argue that alcohol was the cause of many societal ills in the United States, things like corruption and crime, infidelity and abuse, especially spousal abuse against women as men would return home drunk, and accidents were all blamed on alcohol. The movement was supported by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, rural areas in the South and the West, and in 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. The amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages, and everywhere across the United States, alcohol was just dumped out, as you can see in the picture there. Prohibition ushered in an era of crime in the United States. Speakeasies were illegal bars and nightclubs that gave Americans easy access to alcohol. They were referred to as speakeasies because people were supposed to speak quietly about them in public and inside so as to not alert the police of their existence. Bootlegging was prevalent as many made their own alcohol and sold it. Bootlegging was a lucrative business and increased organized crime as mob bosses like Al Capone fought over the selling of alcohol. It was said that Al Capone made $60 million a year from selling alcohol in the 1920s. Prohibition was a failure as the government did not provide the means to enforce the law. And in 1933, the government did something it had never done up to that point and has not done since. It repealed an amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment, ratified in 1933, made alcohol legal again in the United States. During the 1920s, we see new things emerge that improved the lives of Americans. Washers, vacuums, electric sewing machines, refrigerators, toasters, and most importantly, the car. Henry Ford's Model T changed America forever in the 1920s. The automobile was once for the rich, but Ford's Model T was affordable for many Americans, and between 1908 and 1927, 15 million Model Ts were mass-produced. The Model T came in one color, black, and windshield wipers and headlights were optional. The automobile gave Americans a new freedom. Gas stations, motels, and shopping centers popped up everywhere. People could go further faster for shopping and entertainment. More people moved to the suburbs away from the cities and could now travel wherever they wanted. We see the emergence of a new woman in the 1920s following the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. It was the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote. These new women were known as flappers as they were emancipated from the traditional role for women from before the 1920s. They rejected that cult of domesticity that said that women were to stay home and not have a role outside of their house. These women dressed differently, shorter skirts, vibrant colors, and short hairstyle. These were things you would not see before the 1920s. These flappers went out in public and smoked, drank, danced, and dressed much more provocatively. They wore makeup and even attended parties, oftentimes without a man or a chaperone. Women were much more visible in American society during the 1920s. Women continued to enter the workplace in high numbers in the 1920s, but they were still primarily involved in what were considered to be women's professions, like nurses and teachers. Well, I'll argue in the 21st century, teachers is a very manly profession, but also librarians and a number of office roles like stenographers and secretaries. There were few women managers, and most middle-class women remained at home, as few combined marriage and career, but this was changing for American women. The 1920s was also a time of new experiences, with the birth of the radio, jazz, and movies. It was also a period of great American literature and many celebrities. In 1920, KDKA, based out of Pittsburgh, established the first commercial radio station in the United States, leading to the emergence of hundreds of stations across the country. Imagine the impact of this new technology. Now people could hear the president's voice. They could listen to the World Series. They could hear election returns as they came in. They could listen to symphonies performing from across the country. The radio gave Americans access to news, sports, other entertainment, as well as commercials. It was a shared experience, and by 1929, 40% of American homes had radios, some 12 million families. Jazz can be considered the first truly American art form, and it emerged out of the 1920s. It started in New Orleans before moving north. Performers like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith became major pop culture icons in the United States for black and white audiences. The era was also rich with great American literature, with books like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt, and the truly exceptional Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. In the 1920s, we see the rise of the film industry in the United States, based out of Hollywood and Los Angeles. Before 1920s, movies were silent, and oftentimes there would be someone playing the piano in the theater. In 1927, Al Jolson starred in the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, and in 1928, Walt Disney's Steamboat Willie, which is considered to be the debut of Mickey Mouse and his girl Minnie, was the first animated movie with sound. The addition of sound to movies doubled the number of tickets sold by 1930. We see movie palaces in every major city as millions of Americans flock to see the latest offerings along with the stars of the day, like Clara Bow, Rudolph Valentino, and Charlie Chaplin. No different from today when people will go to movies to see people like Angelina Jolie, Tom Hanks, and Johnny Depp. These movies and their stars will have a big impact on American pop culture. Movies, magazines, and newspapers created national fads in clothing and hairstyle. People wanted to be like the people they saw on the screen and read about in the magazines. On the right there, you see a 1920s cover from Vogue magazine. Some of the other celebrities included Newt Rockne, the legendary player and coach of Notre Dame, Red Grange, considered to be the greatest college football player of all time by many, Bobby Jones, who dominated golf in the 1920s as an amateur, Will Rogers, one of the most famous entertainers of the time, Harry Houdini, who's known as the amazing escape artist, Jack Dempsey, one of the greatest fighters of all time, who held the heavyweight title for 7 years, Babe Ruth, arguably the greatest baseball player of all time, who helped transform baseball into America's pastime, and maybe the biggest icon of the era, Charles Lindbergh, the American aviator who rose to fame in 1927 when he flew the Spirit of St. Louis nonstop from New York to Paris, a feat that had cost 6 other pilots before him their lives. Let's close the show by quickly considering the event that really marked the end of the 1920s. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the American stock market crashed and the American economy quickly collapsed. Black Tuesday marked the start of the Great Depression, and we'll consider that next time. But until then, good night, Albuquerque.